Dormancy care for orchids. Some orchids go through a dormant period where they will slow down their growth or actually stop growing altogether. At this period, the grower's biggest question is, should you be watering your orchids during this dormancy? So that brings us to episode 10 of our hotly debated orchid care topics. Welcome to the Nature Company. Today we'll be looking at the two different viewpoints or stances taken on this watering of orchids during dormancy. The one being orchids should never be watered when they're dormant or leafless as they've gone into their dormancy. And the second one being water should be given to orchids during this period, but in much lower quantities than normal, just to ensure you don't get wrinkling or shriveling of the pseudobulbs. So let's take a look at the two of these and see what's going to be best for our orchids, especially when we've got to look at the type of orchid we have, our climate, and the conditions that we are growing them in. And at the end of the video, we'll go through the different orchids that will suit the different methods better. If this is the kind of information you're interested in, please hit that subscribe button down below if you haven't already, and that notification bell to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. So let's have a look at what dormancy is. Well, it's a stage that the orchids will get to. It's generally after a flowering, and what it does is it ensures that all the moisture and nutrients that it starts receiving is stored in those pseudobulbs or other storage units in the plant itself. This is so that it can get through a tough period that generally it's acclimatized to getting. It's an adaptation to ensure it can survive through tough periods, and then as soon as the climate comes right for it again, it can burst into new growth. So what happens here is it slows down its metabolic rate and it slows its growth, or it even stops growing altogether. And often at this point, they'll lose all their leaves. So with orchids that go dormant, a lot of them are deciduous. They'll lose all their leaves at some point of the year. And these are usually related to things like seasonal changes in temperature, where your temperatures suddenly drop, they get lower, and often much drier conditions too. It can also undergo dormancy due to the fact that the number of daylight hours starts to reduce, and this can force a dormancy too, because perhaps if there's not enough daylight hours, the plant isn't going to be able to produce enough food for it to keep growing healthily, so it may as well just go dormant over that period. Or it could just be the natural life cycle of the plant itself. And as I said, not all orchids undergo dormancy, but often those that do lose all their leaves. And this is just preparation for that dormant cycle, and this is generally to help conserve the energy for the new growth after the dormant cycle. This just means the energy stored in the pseudobulbs is not going to be used up to keep the leaves alive during periods which aren't going to be conducive to growth. And of course, some of those orchids that will undergo this dormancy are things like your Catasetinae, your Catasetums and allied orchids, things like your Cassis, your Chissus, Cissus, whatever you want to call it, your Tunias, your Pleone and Calanthe also undergo this dormancy, along with several of your Dendrobium types. Dendrobium aggregatum or Dendrobium lindleyi is also one of them, and this does tend to lose all its leaves after just a single year of growth, although occasionally you can get some of these leaves to last several years. And then of course your Dendrobium noble types. These also need that winter rest period, that dormancy that they go through to ensure that you're going to get proper flowering out of them. And that will take us directly to viewpoint 1, which is never water your orchids during dormancy. Traditional growers say that you should never water your orchids as your orchids enter dormancy, especially once those leaves have fallen, especially things like your Catasetums and of course those Dendrobium noble types. And the reason they say this is that it's just mimicking their natural habitat, especially things like those Catasetums. They're used to having 4 to 5 months of absolutely no rainfall at all, and you have to mimic that to get the best out of your orchid. And also because your orchids have gone dormant during this phase, The roots aren't absorbing any moisture, so you're going to have that water sitting in them for longer periods, which is going to cause root rot and the rotting of your pseudobulbs. So you have to not water them during these periods to prevent fungal and bacterial infection. And thirdly, to keep your orchid's growth strong. It is essential to give it the stress period to ensure that the new growth comes out strong and not as weak and limp as they appear if you keep watering throughout this. And by allowing your orchid to go through the dormancy season properly, it's helping encourage stronger growth in the next season. Whereas by watering throughout that dormancy period, you're going to land up with much weaker, softer growth and very little flowering. And scientific studies on Catasetinae have shown a drastic decrease in metabolic activity during these dormancy periods. And this means that they absorb or draw in a lot less moisture than they would otherwise. And since these pseudobulbs are big water holding supply chambers, by adding extra moisture in and around them, especially at these cooler periods, you are encouraging fungal and bacterial growth. So what then are the best practices going to be? As soon as your leaves fall off, stop watering altogether. And only start watering again when you see that new root growth starting to happen. That is going to be the time to start watering again. Not when you see the new growth starting, but when you see the new roots coming off that new growth. Otherwise, you're still allowing for excess moisture to be available for infections to take place before the plant itself is able to take in that moisture through the roots. So then you're wanting to keep that orchid in a dry, well-ventilated, bright, indirect sunlight spot for it to see through its dormancy properly. But Viewpoint 1 comes with a big warning sign. Woo, 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 woo. It's some growers battle to keep those pseudobulbs from wrinkling by keeping water off your plant completely. So this is where Viewpoint 2 comes into play. And what is that? Well, Viewpoint 2 says water minimally during this dormancy period. Reduce your watering right down, but allow for watering to reduce the chances of your pseudobulbs from wrinkling and causing stress to your plant. So you're not completely withholding water to cause the over dehydration of your plants, especially in those dry indoor conditions. So why do some of these growers suggest that watering your orchids during dormancy is important? Well, for one, it's to stop that shriveling of the pseudobulbs. Just by applying small amounts to your orchids very occasionally, you can still keep your pseudobulbs nice and firm to ensure that at the end of dormancy, it has all the strength to have some good growth. Also, it helps in those low humidity environments, especially like indoors, where there's air conditioners or heaters being used that suck the moisture out of the air. That's also sucking the moisture out of your plants. So you may need to add that little bit of extra moisture to help keep them stable during this period. And again, they say this actually mimics better what happens in the natural environment than withholding water completely. Because in the natural environment, there may be fogs or mists, or even due to those day-night temperature fluctuations, there could be heavy dewfalls. And all of these will supply small amounts of moisture that would be available to your plant so that it doesn't dehydrate completely. And there have been studies done to prove that orchids still lose moisture through respiration during this dormancy period. So if your humidity levels are too low, they could desiccate too far, causing shrinking and shriveling of your pseudobulbs. I don't know why I said all the S's in a row. And that could cause major stress on your orchid and may not allow it to bounce back the way it should be able to when spring comes back around. So what are going to be your best practices if you're following Viewpoint 2? Well, perhaps a light misting occasionally, especially if you start to see those pseudobulbs starting to wrinkle or shrink, just to help maintain a bit of pressure inside the plant so it doesn't desiccate further. Also, perhaps you want to put a few drops of water in around the base of the plant there by the roots, just to allow for that extra little bit of moisture for it to slowly absorb without letting the moisture to be around for too long. We don't want to keep wet, damp, soggy plants during these dormancy periods where the plant isn't really active. So you only want to be putting these small few drops of water in and around the plant every 4 to 6 weeks, just to ensure it doesn't desiccate too far. And then again, you want to ensure that that media will dry out quickly again afterwards. You don't want that damp, soggy media that will cause bacterial and fungal infection. And these dormancies generally happen when temperatures cool down a bit, and we all know what happens when you have cool dampness. Fungus just thrives. And the big warning here as well, is remember, overwatering during this period can cause early root growth. The roots can come out too early and they'll be long, spindly, and not be able to support the strength of the new growth that's going to happen in spring. So rather hold back on the water to the point of dryness before watering again. We don't want the plant to prematurely start growing and then it can't support that growth. So which method is going to be best? Well, the right approach depends on the type of orchid you have and your growing conditions. So let's have a look at those different orchids and which method will suit them best. Well, let's start off with your Catasetinae type, your Catasetums and others. As soon as their leaves have fallen off, then you stop watering altogether until you start seeing that new root growth coming out of the new shoots. And then you can slowly start increasing your watering and your feeding for your plant. Early watering for these can be very detrimental. And then your Dendrobium lindleyi and your Dendrobium noble types, they are often best to be left as much alone as possible. But if you do start seeing the shrinking, then give them a little spritz, a little bit of a misting to help maintain the turgor of your pseudobulbs. If they get too much water during this winter period or this dormancy period, you won't get flowers at all. When the new growth comes around, it will all be kikis and you'll have missed your flowering for that season. And with your lindleyi, if your winter temperatures are not cool enough, then by keeping this almost completely dry for the whole dormancy period, you're more likely to get blooms out of it than if you water it during that period. So by keeping it dry, you can overcome some of that winter temperature drop that they need to flower. So drying can be helpful in those warmer climates if you're growing Dendrobium lindleyi. And your Calanthe and Pleone, and even to agree your Tunia, they need to have just that little bit of extra moisture through your dormancy periods. They don't like to dry out too far, but not that full watering regime. I'll still allow them to dry. So reduce your watering to a very light watering every 4 to 6 weeks. So what are the key takeaways here? Orchids like your Catasetinae and some of your Dendrobiums really need to be kept completely dry during that dormancy period. If you have incredibly dry climate, very little humidity, then maybe a slight misting can just help keep those pseudobulbs from wrinkling too far. And that will help reduce the stress on your orchid, especially when it comes time to burst back into new growth in spring. And then only resume watering as soon as you see the new growths or the new root growth start forming, because that's when the plant is going to start absorbing water again. Don't water when the new shoots start coming out, because then you can start causing rot in that new growth. Allow that new growth to get big enough that they can then start to produce roots, and then start your watering. And the final tip is to look for signs. Look at your orchid, watch it carefully during that period. If you see the leaves fall off, don't water. If you see the pseudobulbs just start wrinkling slightly, then you probably don't need to water. If you start seeing that wrinkling and shrinking going too far, then some misting occasionally to help maintain turgor inside your pseudobulbs is beneficial. And then when you see that new growth happening, look for those new roots. As soon as you see those new roots, then start your watering. And if you stick to this basic guideline, you should have great success with the dormancy of your orchids and set them up to really grow well in the new coming seasons. If you need any further guidance on this, Ed posts up a lot of information down in that Buy Me a Coffee link. There's information available there to everyone, and there is also some members only content. So don't be shy, sign up, become a member, and grow like a pro. And thank you for watching. If you found any of this information helpful, please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button down below, and that notification bell, bing bong, to be notified of all our upcoming content so you don't miss out on a thing. Help us grow as we help your orchids grow.